working in collaboration with colleagues throughout the years from different museums, and that's been possible in part as a consequence of the trips that this organization has done in the past. And I think we all obviously benefit from the work that you do. I've been going through an experience of acculturation today, being here at home, but having lunch at breakfast time, for example. 12:30, it's actually lunchtime right now, I think. I will try to regain my footing, and I'll do that by focusing, for the most part, on pictures by Rubens, since we are in what is one of his homes. What you see on the screen is a bad attribution. This is said to be, in the Thyssen webpage, a painting by Rubens copied after Titian, made when he was in Spain in 1628-29, and it certainly is not that. It is most likely a Rubens workshop copy after one of the paintings that he made. What it certainly is not is a painting made at the same time and by the same person who made other copies after Titian when he was in Madrid. And this is not based on a hunch, but based on careful research, especially of those other paintings. I'm being a bit provocative with this by showing you a slide that all Rubens people here will recognize as not by the master's hand. This may be less obvious to others. But I think as soon as we say something about wrong attribution or attribution to someone, we activate our senses, we become attentive. And I think that's natural because all of us are good at this. That's why we study art history. We were good at high school when we started looking at things. We were good at reading the world through images, but also at comparing them and relating them. And we heard psychological reasons or scientific reasons why that's the case. Everybody here is good at connoisseurship. And it's also a very important thing. There's a lot at stake in this activity when we devote our thought to it. And I think that's because paintings are very important things. They deliver us to higher places. They're very, very important to our lives. And therefore, it matters a lot to us to know who made them, how they were made, where they were made. We place a lot of value on them. This includes market value, of course, and that means that we need to be able to separate copies and fakes and workshop paintings as well. And this is really the job of the connoisseur, and the word remains, I think, a little bit too maybe elite, or I remain unhappy with the sound of it, but it remains an activity that we do have to work at. Of course, we know a lot about workshop activity. We know that paintings were done in workshops. We know that Vasari tells us that Giovanni Daudine, for example, in a picture from 1513 on the left, Giovanni Daudine made the musical instruments on the lower part of that picture. We know that Jacopo Tintoretto, when he died in 1594 in Venice, had left a will where he said that his son Domenico should finish his paintings as he had been doing during Jacopo's own lifetime. We know that Cranach was paid for traveling to Torgau with 10 assistants. We know that Van Mander tells us that painters in Malines made pictures, that teams of painters made pictures, some by painting faces and hands, some by painting costumes, some by painting only the landscapes. We have a lot of information of this kind, and some of this information, a good amount of it actually, comes from Rubens. And this will be very familiar, I think, not only to people working on Rubens, but to people who work on the issue of attributions, connoisseurship, workshop in general, because he gives us more information than most. This, by the way, is another workshop picture, another bad attribution that you have on the screen. I'll get to it in a minute. But I think most of you know the correspondence by Rubens, all of it published, well translated also, that tells us many things. We know that in 1611, in May, he'd been back in Antwerp only for 2.5 years. He says that he has to refuse up to 100 people that want to study under him, pupils, assistants, young aspiring painters that would be part of a workshop. And we know that a visitor to his studio at one point mentions the fact that Rubens works with a large number of assistants. And we know contracts such as one from 1620 for the Jesuit Church of Antwerp, where he says in writing in a document that we know that he will design the pictures and they will be made by his assistants, and he mentions one by name, Anthony van Dyck. We know a famous letter by Rubens of 1618 where he lists his paintings which he's offering for an exchange with a collector in England, for sale, we could say. Some of these paintings, he says, are done by the workshop, some with retouching by him, some are made entirely by his own hand, and there's a wide range of how these pictures were made. So we have no doubt that paintings were made within a workshop system. This is obvious to us. It's obvious also, especially to people who work in medieval methods of production. The modern era is the era of that. What I'm going to do now is to show you a few Rubens pictures mainly, then a few others, and simply try to walk through slides by thinking about what are the issues that one needs to focus on when looking at Rubens paintings and workshop practice, and also some other issues that come up when looking at this artist. The painting that you saw here came up in the market in Madrid in 1999. I had just arrived to this country from after a number of years in the States and had just been hired by this museum, and it was being offered with a special monographic publication supported by a reputed curator and connoisseur for a lot of money to the Spanish state, and it was being offered after that publicly at auction. The picture was supported by a lot of expensive-looking materials, photos, a lot of words, even documentary evidence. It was said to be the same picture that was inventoried in the Alcázar, the royal palace in Madrid, in 1636 by Rubens, measuring what this actually measures, showing a man kneeling on with a red cloth on the right and a woman dressed in blue with a hand on a melon. This picture was not purchased by the Spanish state in the end. It was shopped around Europe. It was shown in England and Paris, that I know maybe more places. It was supported by a monographic publication looking quite luxurious, that if one knew what was going on behind the scenes, had been paid for by the owner of the painting, who was actually working hard to see if this could be sold, of course. I had to write a report on what the Spanish state could do, and I had just arrived from academia, of all places, too, running into these problems. And fortunately, I found a 1651 document of the collection of Gaspar de Haro, one of the elite collectors in Europe at the time, and certainly in Spain, which mentioned a painting of the same dimensions, same man kneeling down, dressed in red, a woman dressed in blue with a hand on a melon, copy after Rubens. So this was at least one argument that could be used to say this was not by the master. Why this looks bad will have become obvious to you after a while of looking. The legs of the figure on the right don't seem to come from anywhere logical. And there are very many clear, obvious problems with this. It's tricky always to say that a painting is not good enough to be by an artist. That's usually not the standard we should use. Paintings are or are not characteristic of an artist, and that's really the idea that we should follow. The problem with issues like these, and this is where authority can be a two-sided sword, is that how do we make sure our attributions or our findings make it into the literature? In this case, someone was pushing very hard for the painting, and as I said, even publishing a very good-looking book and monograph in two languages, two different books, an edition in Spanish and one in English, pushing for the attribution. That book made it into the secondary literature, and a fairly recent book of collecting in Spain included this painting as the actual Rubens in the royal inventories, and the 2015 article in Zeitschrift für Kunstgeschichte, which deal with something else, simply with how these pictures were displayed in the Alcázar in Madrid, now has further moved this same painting into the literature. What should one do about this? What should we do? It's something for us to think about. Nobody's going to devote time to publish bad attributions or to insist on this, except if you have a very strong, very obvious vested interest in doing so, and you want to spend your time worrying about this. What I'm going to show you now are several images, mainly great Rubens paintings, and I'm going to point to things that I think are typical of the artist. It was said for a while that Rubens really worked very, very often, almost in all cases, with the workshop, and that's really a trend that's been corrected now for a couple of generations, and we know that Rubens made very many paintings only by himself, or at least what we see is only by himself, and then he made paintings in collaboration, and then he made a lot of paintings with the workshop. Rubens is a particularly hard case because we still know about 1,500 paintings by him, and these include paintings that are large and small, made with different goals in mind for different people on different surfaces. and throughout a very extensive life. So it's very hard to find one standard. Actually, it does not exist. You have to find several different standards and create pockets to try to understand the way in which he worked and the way in which he interacted with the workshop. One of the most obvious paths into this problem of Rubens and workshop assistants is the retouching. The sense that one has when seeing Rubens paintings that there are several layers, which is a very obvious feeling one has, and how these layers work and who is adding those final layers. And usually in Rubens and pictures made by the workshop and retouched by Rubens, you really do recognize a sense of a last touch of the brush or a last layer of retouching. But you also see that, of course, on fabulous only Rubens paintings. And in part, I've chosen pictures that you can see in the galleries here so that you can go and enjoy this game all on your own. This is a fabulous picture that Rubens paints for himself, we think, that I show you here in a detail, where you have a lot of this layering and adjusting foreground and background and enlivening surfaces, a lot of surface activity on the side of Rubens. And this is the kind of thing that Rubens does to workshop paintings, but it's also the kind of thing that he does to his own paintings. And you simply have to learn to recognize things as obvious as calligraphy, or you have to learn to recognize things as abstract but also obvious once one sees a lot, as quality of different layers. And there's some paintings that are especially good to learn this. One of them is this large Adoration of the Magi in the Prado, which was painted in two phases, one in Antwerp in 1609, a few months after he had arrived there from Italy, which was a lot shorter, a lot smaller than this, more or less from here on down and from here on to the left, which he extensively repainted when he was in Madrid 20 years later, and which he also added on to in top and right side. What's interesting about this is that you really have a sense, and you gain this by careful looking, that their two paintings overlap, that over the previous painting, Rubens almost like, you could almost unhang a gauze, a very thin canvas from it, and you can see what he has done. And he has overpainted most of it, but not all of it. So this thin gauze that you would remove, if you could, would be full of holes. Some areas he retouched, some he did not. And you really learn from this to recognize personal retouching by this artist. And I'm showing you, I can't see it very well with this angle, but what you see there, you can see that the right red sleeve of that magus, this man here in the center of the painting, it was originally quite a bit shorter than Rubens made it 20 years after he originally painted it. We have an exact copy of the original, and the X-ray of this painting in Madrid coincides in every minute detail to that copy that we have of the original, so we know these things for a fact. So this sleeve was a little bit shorter. And the tone of the red extension and retouching is a little bit different from the original, and you learn to recognize that tone of that retouching throughout that red surface. He's trying to make it a little bit less solid, a little more painterly. And this is the kind of retouching that you really, again, learn to recognize in Rubens' paintings, and see it in a lot of his workshop pictures as well. This is a picture from the life of Achilles, one of the series of tapestries that Rubens designed. This is one of the modelli, the kind of large, quite finished sketches or preparatory works that he makes to show a client or to give to the studio, to the workshop, to the tapestry weavers' workshop, so that they can, he gives to his own studio, they can make the large cartoons, and those are then sent to the weavers. Again, for Rubens people, those of us who spend much of our time looking at things by this artist, there's kind of an obvious careful quality in this that is not by the hand of the master, but also you learn to recognize some of the retouching in some areas, such as the sky, the head, and the chest of this figure, and also a lot of in the kind of enlivening of the foreground of the landscape. And this becomes a little bit more obvious if you compare this work with another similar, slightly earlier, well, maybe 6, 8, 10 years earlier, picture of similar size, similar function. On the left, what you see is one of the modelli, one of the large preparatory works, relatively large, about this size, for the series of the Eucharist that belongs here to the Prado. And you can see the very different way of rendering this element, for example, or the capitals, or the flowers. I think it becomes quite obvious where you have, this fresh, lively hand of the master, and where you don't have that other than in the surface retouching. You learn to find also little telltale signs, such as the extreme, the edge of the maul stick where he's leaning his right hand while he paints, and you find this in a number of Rubens' paintings, especially smallish paintings, on the right-hand side, usually upper right-hand side, and people that work on Rubens here will have seen that as well. Of course, other people can use this too, but you're adding evidence that ends up forming this picture in your mind of what is different between a Rubens workshop painting and a picture where he has intervened in a picture which is entirely by his hand. And retouching becomes, in his case, something that he says that a connoisseur becomes especially sensitive to. This is a picture I just saw a few weeks ago in the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon, and this is really based on a hunch, so I wouldn't want to carry this too far. But if you see this in the flesh, you'll see a kind of detailed working of this area here and a silky look of this cloth in this area as well. They are very un-Rubens-like, at least they seem that way to me. And again, this is a hunch. Do not do connoisseurship or art history based only on a hunch. But it brings me to something I want to tell you, which is the fact that a lot of Rubens' paintings have retouching by himself. A lot of his workshop paintings have retouching by him. But a lot of Rubens' paintings were retouched later on. He was very famous, very important, very expensive, even during his own lifetime. So there was a lot of reasons to finish up, to retouch, to fix up paintings that could be sold like Rubens's. And these reasons existed throughout the centuries. So it is a problem that people working on Rubens very often encounter. And you find commissions like this one in the mid-1630s in Madrid, that he did for the king in Madrid, Torre de la Parada. But when looking close, you find that calligraphy is changing a bit. He's an older artist, but you still recognize this liveliness of spirit, a category that Chinese connoisseurs already by the 10th century are singling out as one of the things that one needs to be able to identify or overlap with the work of an artist. And in Rubens, it really is very special in particular. It's tricky, though, because in this one commission, we know that Rubens hired a lot of outside workshops to do some of the paintings that he was designing, but we know that he saved at least 14 for himself. But of those 14, some are made not by himself, but by his workshop and simply retouched by him, and you learn how to recognize a lot of this retouching in this area here, which of course could also be done by workshop assistants who were being trained to make paintings that looked like his. So as you see, the problem becomes complicated, and even more so by the fact that in this same series of the Torre de la Parada, painted around 1635 or so, includes some paintings that are painted entirely by him, and you recognize this handling of the brush and this, what is not good or bad, but rather characteristic of his way of painting. Rubens worked in collaboration very often as well, and he collaborated with other artists, but also with his workshop, and there were spin-offs. And collaborate, and this here you see a famous circa 1617 picture, all by Rubens, we think, at least on the surface, and then you see how someone, very Rubensian but unlike him, is using that same body to make a different painting. Little differences, such as the hand of Christ was a little bit more closed, the right hand of Christ. Here it's a little bit more open, but the X-ray shows that the fingers were closed more than they look now. The legs bent down a little bit more, but they used to look more like these do here. The workshop is using Rubens's original to make spin-offs to make money for Rubens. In a workshop, in a case like this, some of us think that you can recognize the hand of Van Dyck. Other colleagues think that is not the case. He collaborates with other artists as well in making what are not really workshop pieces, but collaborative works, such as this picture with Snyders. And you see the still life is all by Snyders, the figures are all by Rubens, but you can see, especially here, and go and see this in the gallery, where you recognize retouching 2 layers of paint and retouching in a style that's very similar to this, which is very characteristic of Rubens around this time, 1612, 13, 14, 11, so on. So again, you really, careful looking and understanding of how the artist works. It's the retouching in this area here. I don't expect you to really understand or see this in the slide, but the pictures in the galleries, and you can go and look at it there. A few more images of Rubens, simply to learn about what is characteristic of him, a strong sense of form and so on. This beautiful contrasting concave and convex lines that are all gathering force, and you end up really, nobody's able to imitate this in Rubens's workshop, as far as we know, of course. This real sense of, this compressed forest that makes these things so pleasurable to look at, Rubens, the new Michelangelo. Also a lot of surface activity of that type. This is also very typical of Rubens. He's a lot of variety and activity and real shying away of flat surfaces and real shying away of repeating patterns also. The calligraphy is full of variety, and he really is giving life to what he paints by doing these things. Beautiful head of one of the apostles that's hanging in the galleries now, but a reminder also of how conservation, restoration can make us doubt paintings and make attributions something that is, less sure than it may seem like at first sight. Look at the way in which Rubens has worked directly up from the ground to the surface of the flesh, to the three-dimensional forms here. If that was cleaned a little bit too much, suddenly it would make no sense. You could almost argue in a picture of this size that has already happened. I don't know if you see what the ground underneath the hair and the ground in this area, and how that very suddenly moves to this very strong volume, a sense of three dimensions that you have in the flesh areas of the face. Again, if this would take a little bit, just a very little bit of too much cleaning, of over-cleaning, to make this simply not work, and we would maybe think that this was a workshop painting if that happened. This picture was donated to the Prado in 1930, and Prado catalogs very soon started saying by 1940 that this may have been painted by Rubens. It's a copy after a picture by Bernard van Orley, and it does certainly have a certain Rubensian taste to it. The Corpus Rubenianum volume, one of the fairly recent volumes, picked up on these early Prado catalog ideas of a certain Rubensian look to it and say that this is actually a picture by Rubens that was painted possibly when the artist is young, after that original by Van Orley. We did a dendrochronology of this, which tells us that it could not have been painted in any way before 1616, and most likely it was painted later, but in any case not before 1616. And I think it seems obvious to people who work on Rubens that if this is by Rubens, it would have to be a much earlier work. It could not really be a work by 1616. The catalog called attention to the fact, rightly so, that this is not a Royal Collection painting in Spain. It's a donation from the 1930s. And sometimes in places like the Prado, we give a lot of credit to the fact that things have a very good pedigree. A lot of pictures were made, certainly in the case of Rubens, directly for the King of Spain, or bought directly by him, or were gifts to him, and they have an old history that supports attributions. But this was a 1930s donation. In fact, it has a B on the lower left corner, and that B does imply that it does come from the Royal Collection. The B is the Palace of La Bobadilla in the outskirts of Madrid, from which a private collector bought a lot of paintings, which were then donated to the Prado. So information gathers, and sometimes we have a hard time knowing what to do with it. I think in a case like this, it's very clear that 1616 is a bit too late for this artist for Rubens to have painted that. Last slide I'm going to show you, just a few weeks ago, or about a month ago in New York, I was shown a painting that's been shown to some other to some other people in the past, and I think some colleagues were also about to look at it in New York at that time. The picture that I was showed was the picture from which the detail on the right has been taken, and it's a copy or a version or a good-looking painting that's almost identical to one of the early Van Dycks that the Prado has, the Taking of Christ, which is hanging in one of the galleries. Letters that accompany this composition by John Rupert Martin and Arthur Wheelock, say from the 1970s and from the early 21st century, talk about it possibly being a picture with a lot of workshop intervention, but a good-looking picture, which indeed it is. What we were able to see now, because we know we have taken x-rays of our painting that didn't exist in the past, is that some things that you can see here, like with the case of the Bosch that we just saw Fritz talk about, some things that we see in this figure, and especially this kind of sliced outfit that this man wears on his back, those are in the x-ray of our painting. So whoever painted this picture on the right was someone who knew a previous stage of our painting, someone who knew what was going on in Van Dyck's studio. And the picture still, when one approaches it, has a kind of a mechanical quality. It seems like a repetition. It seems to lack a little bit of this liveliness that one finds in the original. But clearly it needs to be brought at least as close to the artist as the studio. And I think I'll leave it at that, and we can continue our discussion in a few minutes. Thank you.